They couldn't silence Al Jazeera. Now they're demanding its closure. It is one of 13 demands by Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries which are imposing a blockade on Qatar. Why do they hate Al Jazeera, and how scared are they of freedom of expression? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Unreasonable, unbalanced, and not actionable. That's the Qatari government's reaction to the list of 13 demands from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and their allies. They include closing down the Al Jazeera network. Now, it's often said that journalists should avoid becoming part of the story, but the story of this regional crisis is now putting journalism at the center of it. Al Jazeera says the ultimatum, which must be met within 10 days, won't affect daily business. Fellow journalists and industry representatives are voicing their angry reactions. They see it as an attempt to silence freedom of expression and using the news organization as a bargaining chip in political differences. Our United Nations correspondent Rosalind Jordan has more.
When the diplomatic crisis between Qatar and 3 members of the GCC started nearly 3 weeks ago, some observers said the dispute was less about Doha's alleged support for terrorists and more about shutting down the Al Jazeera media network. Now the Saudis have issued a list of 13 demands to end the crisis, and Al Jazeera's closure is on the list. Al Jazeera has rejected the call as a non-starter.
We're going to continue our jobs as journalists in covering the world, and we call on governments, all governments, to respect media freedom. We hope other media organizations will support our call to defend media freedom.
The countries putting pressure on Qatar did not like Al Jazeera's coverage of the political uprisings across the Middle East starting in 2011. Most famously, Egypt arrested and imprisoned 3 Al Jazeera English journalists in 2014 on the false grounds that they were supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. Media rights groups say the Saudi demands are an attack on free speech.
I think that when we see a concerted effort by a group of states to prevent people from getting news, to censor websites, to censor television and news outlets, we should all be deeply disturbed. Actually, the right to information, to receive and impart information across borders, regardless of frontiers, is an internationally protected human right.
UN officials cautiously reacted to the Saudi demands.
We continue to follow the situation with deep concern. We are aware of reports of a list of demands on Qatar, but we are not able to comment in detail on or confirm such a list. We hope that the countries involved resolve the situation through dialogue. We are ready to assist if requested by the parties, and any resolution or basis for discussion should be consistent with international law, including human rights and international humanitarian law, as well as the UN Charter, as all countries concerned are UN member states.
You might be wondering why the Security Council hasn't taken any action so far on the crisis involving the GCC and Qatar. Diplomats tell Al Jazeera that they want to give Kuwait the time and space to try to negotiate an end to the crisis. And they say that letting the Security Council get involved right now might aggravate tensions, something no one wants. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera at the United Nations.
Well, Al Jazeera has helped put Qatar on the map, but it's long been stuck in a tussle between Qatar and its rivals who see it as a threat to their regimes and their established narratives. Al Jazeera began in 1996 as a tiny network with big ambitions, billed as the first independent news channel in the Arab world. The channel rose to prominence during the Afghan war when its material was used by Western media. It was also the first time that Al Jazeera came under direct attack when a US missile hit its office. The network was under fire again 2 years later when a cameraman was killed when the US bombed its Baghdad bureau. The US accused us of being biased towards Iraq. Al Jazeera went global in 2006 with the launch of this channel. Al Jazeera English was built on the same principles, providing a voice for the voiceless. It also provided a platform for the voice of protesters during the Arab Spring revolts in 2011. That caused the split between Saudi Arabia and Qatar to widen as they took different sides in the upheaval. And again, Al Jazeera was stuck in the tussle, accused of losing impartiality. Al Jazeera journalists were jailed in Egypt during the military coup 4 years ago, which deposed President Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. The following year, Al Jazeera and the Muslim Brotherhood were at the center of a rift pitting Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain against Qatar. One of their demands back then was to shut the network down. Well, let's bring in our guests now to talk more about this. Here in the studio, we have Marwan Kabalan, Associate Analyst at the Doha Institute Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Joining us from Brussels, we have Philippe Leruth, President of the International Federation of Journalists, and in Beirut, Rami Khouri, Senior Public Policy Fellow and Professor of Journalism at the American University of Beirut. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Marwan Kabalan, let me start with you. What do you make of this list of 13 demands by these Gulf countries, particularly the demand to shut down Al Jazeera?
Well, I think it's not as the Foreign Minister of Qatar actually said recently, that they are not actionable, they are not doable, and they are not reasonable, in my opinion. These countries, from the very beginning, it was clear to us that the allegation about Qatar's support of terrorism was mainly the trigger of this crisis, but the key objective was targeting Qatar foreign policy and its soft power tools, and on top of them was Al Jazeera. But in my opinion, they are just making a very big mistake. Why? Because Al Jazeera, they are on the one hand underestimating Al Jazeera, because Al Jazeera is becoming an important part of our political life and a key player in international politics. When they call for the closure of Al Jazeera, I believe that they are not calculating things in the right way. Al Jazeera is very difficult, in my opinion, to just eliminate by giving Qatar or presenting Qatar with this list of demands of 13 conditions.
Rami Khouri, if these demands are completely unrealistic and it's highly unlikely that that they'll be met, then what's the real purpose of them? Is it just to provoke something?
Well, this is still a mystery. It's fascinating. It's been almost 3 weeks, and we really still don't know what motivated the Saudis and the Emiratis and the few others that were hanging on to their financial coattails. The reality is that the terrorism charges are not credible at all. Nobody in the world has actually supported these charges. So there's something else behind this, and there's been many theories. My explanation is that and this is based on talking to people in the Gulf and elsewhere, is that the Qatar is a proxy. Well, Jazeera is a proxy for Qatar, and Qatar is a proxy in Saudi and Emirati eyes and Egyptian eyes, is a proxy for everything that's going on in the region that scares them. Citizen activism, Muslim brothers and Islamists being active in public life, Islamists winning democratic elections in Egypt, for instance, and Morocco and other places, accountability of public officials, free flow of information, a real policy debate in the public sphere on television and radio and in the media. All of these things scare the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians because they just want to keep frozen an old paternalistic, patriarchal, welfare state type of governance anchored in security, controlled by small groups of men mostly. And this is something that the majority of people in the Arab world would like to change a little bit, not necessarily overthrow the whole region, but get more dignity, more participation, more accountability, more meritocracy, etc. And so Qatar and Jazeera in particular are the easiest proxies that these other GCC countries have used. And the striking thing is that not a single major serious country in the world has supported the Saudi Emirati claims or demands. So hopefully they'll clarify what it is they actually want. If they want to have a discussion with Qatar about some of its policies that they think are maybe a threat to them, and if there's any legitimacy to those claims, then they should certainly sit down and talk to Qatar, and Qatar, I'm sure, would talk about it. But there's no evidence of that yet. So we just have to wait and see how the GCC countries that have been involved in this process, and there's only really 3 of them, and one of them, Bahrain, is not a fully sovereign country, really. It's under Saudi tutelage. We'll see how they react. It's up to them to clarify.
I think
You wanted to jump in there.
I just want to say actually that they are trying maybe to finish some unfinished business with Qatar and Al Jazeera, because Saudi Arabia and Emirates, as they represent the counter-revolution forces in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in fact, they believe that Al Jazeera and Qatar were behind the Arab Spring. They were behind the Arab revolutions. And they believe that because of the coverage of Al Jazeera during the revolution in Egypt, Tunisia, and in other Arab places, actually, they just taken they given huge support for this tide of revolution forces. And now they believe it's time actually to finish this unfinished business. They tried in 2014 under the Obama administration. They did not get the support they needed actually from the United States at that time. But now they feel they have a golden opportunity to do that under the Trump administration, because as you perhaps noticed, when President Trump was in the region a few weeks ago, he was like giving a green light for both the Saudis and the Emiratis to go after Qatar and its soft power tools in the region. And this is, in my opinion, what triggered the whole crisis, which came right after the visit of President Trump to the region.
Philippe Larouth, what role do you think a network like Al Jazeera plays, particularly in the public platform in the Middle East, where, let's be honest about it, free media are not many?
Yes, as we told already in a public statement, the reducing media pluralism and freedom of information won't anyhow help solve the crisis, but would rather make it more difficult to resolve. Al Jazeera has been for many years now a major player on the world scale as a free media. And you know, free information is disturbing for some governments, I suppose. And I fear the purpose of all of this is to intimidate, not to get Al Jazeera closed. It seems unthinkable, but maybe to intimidate people working for Al Jazeera, to develop kind of self-censorship, to avoid speaking of some topics. But as we often say, if you silence the messenger, the problems still remain. So once again, if you target Al Jazeera, you target the wrong place. Al Jazeera is and will remain a major information channel.
Rami Khouri, how does this compare with the previous diplomatic spat in 2014 between Qatar and some of these other countries, because they voiced objections to Al Jazeera at that time as well? So what's different about this time now? Like, why now?
Well, what's different is the whole region has continued to evolve and to bubble in many ways, and there's a lot more frightening things going on across the Middle East that the Saudis and the Emiratis don't like. For instance, the signing of the agreement between global powers and Iran was a signal to the Saudis that perhaps Iran was going to be a much bigger player. The eruption of civil wars in different places, the continued strengthening of Islamist movements all across the region. So there's a lot of different things that were starting to happen around the region in the last 3 years that added to the scare that the Saudis and the Emiratis had. In 2014, they handled it quietly through the councils of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Now they've tried to do it in a public way. But it won't work, because Jazeera is not the problem. Jazeera is simply a mirror of Arab public opinion, like any good journalism should be. And the thing about Jazeera is that it is widely respected and supported by ordinary people, because it's the first institution ever in modern Arab history that gave voice to several hundred million people all across the Arab world and held power accountable in Arab countries, and did something else which is critical. Jazeera is the first example of true decolonization, in this case digital decolonization. It took on and bettered the global media companies from the US and England and France and other places, and did a better job than they did in covering the Middle East and giving expression to people's sentiments and emotions and their need to know about what's going on in this region. So it's done a lot of really historic, important things, despite some of the flaws that it still has, especially the Arabic Jazeera. But it's a powerful, powerful phenomenon that is deeply respected across the region. And that's why there's been continuous pressure against it, not just by the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians, but during the Iraq War, the Americans bombed it a couple of times in Afghanistan, and the Israelis have gone after it once or twice. So everybody would like to everybody who wants to keep the Middle East frozen in its state of patriarchal autocracy would like to close down Jazeera, but it's not going to happen because there's massive demand for it.
If I may add something actually to what Rami has just said, I think there are two key differences between the crisis of 2014 and today's crisis. Number one is we have the international context. We have a new U.S. administration less sympathetic with the democracy transformation in the Middle East and more sympathetic, in my opinion, towards autocracies in the Gulf and in Egypt. Number two, actually, we have most of the revolutionary forces in the region. They have lost this round. In Egypt, we have the military coup. In Syria, we have a civil war, a conflict in which so many parties are involved right now. Even in Tunisia, which is actually presented as the successful story of the Arab Spring, is actually having difficulties in transitioning from the stage of in this transitional period actually towards democracy. So I think both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and other forces actually who are supporting them, mainly in Egypt and also Bahrain, if we consider Bahrain a sovereign state, they find that this is maybe the key opportunity in which they can actually put these demands forward and can get something out of it. Because in 2014 they tried, they couldn't get much actually, because as I said earlier, the United States was not actually on board. Now they are having President Trump, at least in my opinion, on board, and this is why they are putting all this pressure on Qatar so that the Qataris may actually concede this time.
Philippe Labrousse, how would you compare what's happening with Al Jazeera right now to similar disputes throughout the world? I mean, the comparison there was a comparison made about if this happened in somewhere else in the world, it would be seen as ridiculous as well.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I never experienced such a thing, and I have long been busy on international level as a defender of journalists' rights. We had the last year we had the United States or even the newly elected French president complaining, for instance, about two Russian media, Russia Today and Sputnik. The newly elected French president, Mr. Macron, described them as propaganda organization and not media organization. He expressed his disagreement, but he didn't ask Russia to close those media. Everyone has the right to disagree with Al Jazeera. I would say they may have the right not to grant interviews to Al Jazeera. Mr. Macron refused interviews to Russia Today and Sputnik. But once again, asking to close a media is something that was never seen, I think, in many years.
Rami Khouri, you mentioned earlier the flaws of Al Jazeera, and there are those in this region, not just the governments of these Arab countries that we mentioned. That Al Jazeera has a bias in favor of certain Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and Al Qaeda, and so on. What do you say to that?
Well, it's clear that there's two different dimensions of how Jazeera Arabic particularly carried out its coverage in the first 10, 15 years. That institutionally, it covered a lot of stories around the region that conservative Arab governments didn't want covered, about citizen activism, about democracy, demands of citizens, uprisings, etc. The second angle is that individual journalists, particularly hosts of programs, sitting in the studio would sometimes express extraordinary enthusiasm for certain political viewpoints, whether Islamist or Arab nationalist or something else, or anti-Israeli or whatever. And so there's two different things that have to be carefully analyzed. The policy of the organization and the individual behavior of individual journalists. You see exactly the same thing if you look at CNN or Fox or other international institutions. So you had the normal biases that came out of individual human beings who got excited about a story or upset about a story, and then you had certain tilts in the policy of journalist organizations that essentially want to cater to their audience. I mean, these are journalistic organizations that are covering the world, trying to do it professionally, but they're working in a certain context. So people in the United States are giving TV coverage that responds to what Americans want and believe in. And so this is normal. So I think the criticisms are really very partly valid, but really not serious at all. And if somebody doesn't like Jazeera, they should do a better job. And we haven't seen anybody do a better job. If you look at the other pan-Arab stations, some of them started to do good stuff about 8-10 years ago in the UAE and Al Arabiya and even in Jordan and other places. People started doing really nice satellite news reporting and TV talk shows, but then they quickly closed shop after about 6 or 7 years because the governments don't want free expression of opinion. This is the bottom line of most of these governments. And you see 30, 40,000 people in jail in Egypt, civil society activists and peaceful protesters. It's not because of their threat they pose, it's because of the ideas they want to express. And governments don't want free expression of ideas. It's very simple.
We'll talk a little bit more about Al Jazeera's various controversies now. This network offers a broad range of opinions than most Arab media, as we've been saying, reporting on subjects that are often taboo. And while it's become the most popular station to watch in the Middle East, it also attracts enemies. The network became famous for televising tapes by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda after the September 11th attacks in the US. Washington accusing the channel of stoking anger and fear about US foreign policy in the region. During the Iraq War in 2003, Al Jazeera again angered the US government by broadcasting pictures of dead Western soldiers and US prisoners of war. Former US President George W. Bush reportedly wanted to bomb Al Jazeera's headquarters here in Doha, but was warned against it by Britain's Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair. Al Jazeera is seen as being bold in ensuring fair representation of different sides and broke an important barrier by being the first in the Arab world to air Israeli views. That and coverage of other sensitive and sometimes taboo subjects is often why Al Jazeera has been banned and its journalists killed, attacked, expelled, and jailed across the Middle East. So let me turn back to you then, Marwan. Has Al Jazeera been entirely fair and objective in its coverage of stories? And should that matter in the context of this regional dispute?
I think Al Jazeera, just like any other media organization in this world, it has its own editorial policy, actually, and it has its own audience that it has to care about and for. In my opinion, we have in the Arab world Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera, and many other media organizations. You might not like the coverage of these channels, but actually you can't ask for them. If you don't like them, you can't ask actually for them to close down or to shut down. I think we need this plurality of views in the Arab world. We need Al Jazeera as much as we need Al Arabiya, as much as we need Sky News and other media organizations. And at the end of the day, in my opinion, as Philip, I would very much agree with what Philip said. They will not get this demand met. Al Jazeera will not shut down. Nobody is going to accept that. They might, and they know that, in my opinion. What they might end up actually having is maybe a shift they might accept a shift in the editorial policy of Al Jazeera, and then Al Jazeera itself will be asking about how to adapt to the new changes maybe, and how to form its identity within different contexts and under different conditions.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much to all three of you, Marwan Kabalan here in the studio, Philippe Larouth in Brussels, and Rami Khouri in Beirut. Thanks very much for being with us. And thank you for watching. As always, you can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. All criticisms, compliments, whatever you want to say are all welcome, as we've been talking about. For me, Hazem Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.